and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on podcastufo.com. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello, and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and we have Alejandro Rojas coming up in just a minute with the news. Our guest this evening, you probably never heard of him. His name is Dr. George Gaines. I spoke to him about another matter, and his story is so incredible, I decided to have him on as a guest. I like having people on that are not like in the mainstream guest lineups. So this guy is, you're going to really enjoy this show, I'll tell you that. Well, last week I had to end the show early, and for those of you out there who have gotten to know me, you know that I am a big animal lover, and I am totally in love with my dog, who collapsed during the show last week. And he has congestive heart failure, but he is okay. We raced off to the emergency vet. He was in oxygen for several hours. But anyway, he's doing okay. But thank you for all the email and all your concern out there. It means a lot to me. So Peanut is still with us. And with that, I will bring on Alejandro Rojas, who met him. How you doing, Alejandro?
I'm a big Peanut fan.
That's right. Met him. He brought him out to Arizona.
I'm glad to hear he's doing better.
Yeah, he hung out.
Yeah, so, he's a cool little guy.
He is. So we're live. I forgot to mention.
Oh my
that.
gosh!
Yes, we are live.
We're live. Ooh, this is nerve-wracking.
It is. And also, for those of you who support the show, I forgot to mention this. Thank you very much. If you can't support the show and want to hear the whole show live, every Wednesday night from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on podcastufo.com or PSN Radio. Dark Matter Digital Network plays the show as a podcast on Thursdays from 10 to midnight. So, Alejandro, I hear you have some scorching heat out there in Arizona.
Yeah. I mean, it's been pretty consistent, about 110-ish for a couple of weeks now at least. So, yeah, it's been warm.
Amazing. I don't know how you do it. I know it's the dry heat, as they say, but still,
yeah.
That's just... you live in air conditioning, right?
Dry heat will kill you just as quickly, I think.
Probably.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, always in the AC because otherwise you will die.
Wow.
It's kind of like if you've seen, it's like that movie, what was that one where they go to Mars and it's Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Oh, yes.
Where he's like, get your bleep to Mars. I'm not sure. I don't think you allow cussing on the show, so I couldn't use the real word.
Yes, we are safe for work here, yes.
Remember that scene at the end where, like, he's out on the surface of Mars and his eyes are bulging out and his head is, like, getting really big? That's what'll happen to you out here if you're in the sun for too long.
You know, I can't believe people lived without air conditioning out there. It's so amazing.
Well, you know what? And there's people who work out there. Like, I'm super busy, like, right now because I'm closing on my house. I'm getting a new house built. It's going to be done tomorrow or the next day.
Whoa.
But there are all of those home builders. There's people building homes all day long out in that heat. And I don't know how they do it. They get an early start, but it's still, for me, right when I get up, not that I'm an early bird, but I mean, it's still hot at like 8 o'clock. So, yeah, it's warm.
Someone just wrote in the message board, Alejandro, that they miss your show. But you did a show, right? It just came out, right?
I did a show recently with Morgan Bell, who is the Florida state director for MUFON. So I just posted that yesterday. It was a little late because of all the home paperwork stuff. I had to do a half-day Monday, so I couldn't get it up Monday as usual. But, yes, I do have a new show up. All of this and some vacation has meant that I haven't been able to do a couple shows in the last few weeks. So, go check it out. It's a great show. It was a lot of fun. We're talking about the upcoming MUFON Symposium, which is at the end of next month. I'll be speaking there, but we talk about all of the other really great speakers who will be there, some of whom don't go to lectures or conferences often that I think are really interesting. So we talk about that and other things that Florida MUFON's working on. That other people probably are not aware of. Morgan was also part of the Homeland Security video from Puerto Rico, the group that investigated that. So we talked a little bit about that also, but I've had Morgan and others with that group on to talk about that in more depth.
Before we move on to news, I just want to tell you I had who's the guy with the bow tie? I'm just drawing a blank.
Rich Hoffman.
Yes, he was on a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about that case. And I mentioned to him, Mark D'Antonio thinks it's a balloon, but what Mark doesn't really know is that there was a lot that led up to this sighting. In other words, the object was going at high speed. There's a lot of data involved in this that makes it such a strange case. Yeah,
Mark admittedly has not completely finished his analysis of that video because it's a lot of work. It took the SCU group 2 years to do it. Mark often will take the data available to him, meaning the video data, to analyze the video itself. This particular video, because it was on a military camera system which kept recorded a lot of telemetry, gives you a lot of data. And his initial idea was that it probably is a balloon, and he has that's his theory. Now, he admits he's got to do more work to prove that and demonstrate it, but Mark's an expert. Mark knows video well. However, I just feel rare, which is rare in this case. We have even higher experts. We have people who work on these particular systems, and they have a lot of compelling arguments, such as a balloon's not going to be that hot. The balloon is really dark, indicating a very hot object, much hotter than a balloon.
Right. Mm-hmm. And the thing when it splits after it goes through the water, I mean, there's just a lot of bizarre things.
Now, interesting enough, the expert of that system, he agrees with Mark that the speed of the object is a little bit difficult to determine based off of the video. And he also says it's difficult to necessarily determine what happened at the end, whether it went in and out of the water, like it appears to do. However, the SCU group, does have some interesting data to show that it did do that and that it was moving quickly. So, there's a lot of interesting aspects to that video.
Yeah. Now, I guess we're on to talk about the news, and we haven't done
what
that
news?
yet.
UFO news. Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But this has been good. So, but
good.
Has anything? Let's see. You and I just talked the other day. Anything going on out there?
Oh, I'm doing the awkward thing again. Okay, yes, there is, and you can't stop me because it's a live show. But anyway, there are some interesting stories that have been posted lately. Both of these come from Roger Marsh, the director of communications for MUFON. And he posts stories, of course, on openminds.tv. And the latest are a couple. One of them is a sighting from July 19th. It was at 2 p.m. There's no photos or videos with this one. However, it was a reddish-brown object that they said was hot dog-shaped. They felt that this thing might have been a creature. They said it was making a swimming motion in the air, similar to an eel. So they don't think it was a drone, but they think possibly it was some sort of creature. So that's kind of interesting. They saw this while they were driving on the highway. But, kind of a interesting little story there. Now, there are others. Trevor James Constable, most famous for hit the space critters and thinking that maybe some UFOs are actually living beings. There's also the story of Abanis, which is a name that Jaime Maussan and some others gave to long UFO-looking objects. However, the majority of those videos look to be strings of balloons, like the wedding arches where they have all these balloons in a string. And I was even at his conference once, and bless their hearts, these investigators who were showing the video, they're like, it looks a lot like balloons. You zoom in, and it looks exactly like balloons. But we think maybe it's weird. And it's like, well, that's just not convincing enough. However, more interesting perhaps is a video from Virginia, which was taken on July 24th at 8:55 p.m. It's also a fun video because you hear these women in a car and they're like, oh my gosh, what is that? What is that? And this configuration of lights in a triangle goes over their car. Now, it looks like a conventional craft. However, there is a red light in the middle that is blinking. So this one hasn't been investigated. It's a short video, so I'd recommend people take a look at it. A very clear video. This thing was going right overhead. And I don't know that conventional aircraft have a red blinking light in the middle, so that would be kind of weird. Some people have said, well, maybe it's a hang glider or something like that. But, an interesting video that these people took just a couple days ago.
Now, was this posted by Roger Marsh as well?
It was.
So that means it's in the hands of MUFON. It's just not been investigated yet?
Exactly. The investigation is underway, and in fact, he notes that their STAR team is looking into it. So, and the STAR team are kind of like the more seasoned and expert investigators.
Right. Now, did you say anything about a drone, or has anyone talked about the possibility?
No one has really. This thing doesn't look like a drone. It looks too large to be a drone.
Mm-hmm.
So, you'll have to check out the video. And it seems to be moving over a pretty vast distance. So, nobody's really gone with drone on this one. But if you want to be the guy that, lays down a few dollars on drone,
no,
go for it. Well, you haven't seen the video. Maybe you're right. I don't know.
No, just with your description, I'll take your word on this one.
Yeah, so it is interesting. So I know Roger was excited about this one. So we'll see what it turns out to be. When we have these sort of videos, I half expect soon after I post it for someone to say, I know what it is, and they figure it out, because that often happens, which I think is great. That's one of the great things, is kind of crowdsourcing, looking into these things. Some people don't like to do that because they're like, someone's going to debunk it, and I know it's an alien. But I like to do that because then everybody can put their heads together to figure out what something is. And if it can withstand that sort of scrutiny, then you have something truly mysterious. So nobody has, though, yet come back and said, hey, I know what that is. So
are you talking about this posting on the Facebook page where a lot of people look over these sightings? Is that what you mean? Or right on the website they make comments?
On all of these places.
Yeah.
Kind of on the internet, anywhere on the internet.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people looking at the internet, luckily.
That's for sure. I guess, we're close to being out of time. Did you have another story? I know there was a couple of interesting ones since last week.
There's so many interesting stories. We have some older stories that we posted as well. We posted some photographs from Italy from 1972. This is one of the videos that we do where we take some old pictures out of our archives. And typically these are pictures that are, before Photoshop. that have some sort of history because they've been investigated, and share those pictures and their investigation. So we've got that. And also, one of the more famous, or at least it used to be, UFO landing cases. This was investigated by Ted Phillips, who's known for that sort of thing. This was in Delphos, Kansas in 1971, where a young man was outside with his dog, and they saw, according to the kid, this mushroom-shaped object come fly in, land in their yard, and fly away. And there was a ring left on the ground. It's a controversial case. But and also these guys won some money, and this is kind of a neat story, and I have a picture embedded there of this panel. The National Enquirer was actually giving out awards for the best UFO cases. No. And they had a panel of investigators who would look at these cases and choose them, and this one was chosen. And, there is some debate, even by one of the scientists who was on that board, that perhaps they were just trying to get that award, and it was reward, and it was not a genuine incident.
I never heard that side of the story. I know it was a farm, and this ring was left on the ground. They took pictures of the ring. I think the woman, something happened when the mother and father came out to take the picture. The mother...
there's a suspected missing time element and some others. But it's very typical of an in-depth openminds.tv story like this one to have aspects in the in-depth research that we do of the case that you've never heard before.
That's good. No, thanks so much.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure.
Yeah, and thanks for being live. I know it's awful hard for you to do because you're trying to get out of the office. And good luck with your closing tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks, man. You have a great one. I hope you have a great show. I'm really interested in your guest tonight and his sighting. It sounds really cool. So you have a good evening, and thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, talk to you next week.
Talk to you later.
All right. So our guest this evening is Dr. W. George Gaines. He grew up in Pensacola, Florida, and he's lived and worked throughout the United States and Europe. And we're going to talk about a sighting he had, an encounter he had when he was very young, and what followed after that. And welcome to the show, George.
Well, thanks, Martin. I'm pleased to be with you tonight.
Thank you. Now, it's funny, you and I talked on the phone about a whole nother subject, and I came clean and told you I did a show on UFOs. That's how our conversation started.
Right. Yeah.
And so can you give a little bit of background, and also you've had a professional career and all that, and it's interesting how this encounter probably changed your way of thinking, didn't it?
It certainly did. And let me just begin by saying that much of the story that I'll tell tonight has been reconstructed over a long period of time. A lot of what I'm going to tell, I didn't know at the time, but it's things that I have found out since then by doing research and follow-up. So people might wonder, well, did you know this at the time? And the answer is no. Of course I didn't know. I was a 12-year-old kid. All I knew is what happened that night. And, as an adult, I have tried to follow this as best as I could. And it's only in recent years that I was able to learn more about the sighting.
Oh, you actually learned more. Now, is this... why don't you go into the story, how the whole encounter began and the whole situation?
Sure. Well, we go back to July the 23rd, 1956, Pensacola, Florida. Pensacola, at the time, and still is, the cradle of naval aviation. It's there are many bases there that were there back in the 50s, and probably even more than there are today. at least a half a dozen bases where naval aircraft flew in and out regularly. I was born in Pensacola. My father was a naval aviator during the war, and also an instructor, and then he ended up flying heavy bombers in World War II out of England for the Navy. Not too many Navy pilots flew heavy bombers out of England in World War II, but my dad was one of those, and was fortunate enough to survive. I'll come back to him a little bit later because he's an interesting figure in his own right.
Mm-hmm.
So, I grew up in an environment of being extremely familiar with aircraft in the sky, day, night, and I prided myself as a young aviation enthusiast. I mean, my goal was to become a Marine Corps pilot one day. That never happened, but I was very, very interested in aircraft and could identify any aircraft by type and model or so forth, and I was also interested in UFOs. I'll just say that right up front. I remember at a very tender age when the Roswell incident was first publicized. I remember how excited my mother got about it, and she told me about it. And from the earliest times I can remember, I was interested in astronomy, in the stars, in aircraft, and through what I would call logic, I was convinced in my own mind that we were not alone. But I'd never seen anything and was always sort of looking, but never really saw anything other than what was obvious, aircraft flying at night.
George, hang on just a second there. Can we,
Sure.
Before we move on from this, I wanted to ask you, because you don't hear a lot about people talking about Roswell when it happened. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. I understand that, the news went out and it was in papers everywhere, and,
yes.
It was publicized, and then it was, the weather of the balloon the next day, and then nobody talked about it for many, many years. So do you remember hearing about that, and you probably heard the next day that it was just a weather balloon, but did you remember that in your childhood and as you got older, and then when it resurfaced in the late 1980s, you said, "Oh yeah," or something like that? How did that all play out?
I mean, it was a very powerful early memory. I remember a great deal about my early childhood. It's not the blur that some people have, but I'm fortunate to have some very clear memories. I remember when World War II ended, and I was very small at the time. But I remember the Roswell incident being in the paper. I don't remember reading about it, but I know my mother read about it. And then when they came up with the debunking story, my mother was quite a skeptic, and she says, "I think they've just made that up. I think it's a cover-up." Well, and so that's my earliest recollection of Roswell. And then, of course, when it's been back in the news, several times. I guess I always believed it was just a cover-up by the government to shield us from the truth. Mm-hmm. So that was my attitude. So at the time of the sighting, I would say that I was certainly receptive and anything but a skeptic. But I was not a child that was subject to wild imaginations. I was very scientific in my orientation, and have had a good career as a behavioral scientist, and so I consider myself a pretty cold-blooded, objective observer. So the way this happened was it was a hot summer night. and I had a little girlfriend that lived down the street, and her parents invited me and her to go out to the airport. And, of course, you might say, well, go to the airport, what is that? Well, in Pensacola in 1956, that was about the most exciting thing for kids to do, was to go out to the airport and wait for the occasional aircraft to land, because then you could see them come up and you could feel the prop wash and all that and see the people getting off and people getting on. It was a very exciting thing to do. So we went out to the airport, and I remember that her mother and father were not particularly interested in hanging around with us. They were in the coffee shop there having, I guess, coffee and pie or whatever they were drinking. And so my little girlfriend and I went out to the fence. And the fence was, this is not like an airport today. I mean, it was just a chain link fence. And I can remember, putting my fingers on it and, holding on to the fence and kind of leaning back and forth. And so we were just looking for aircraft to come in and land. And as it turned out, my girlfriend was a year older than me. She was 13, and she had to wear glasses for distance. But she didn't have them on that night, I guess because she was hoping that I might try to kiss her. Well, that was so far from my mind as a 12-year-old. I mean, I just wasn't about to do anything like that. But she didn't, with being, a young lady, she was slightly vain and wanted to appear very, very attractive, which she was and still is. And so we were looking at the fence and looking up at the moon, which was not a crescent moon, but it wasn't a quarter moon either. It was somewhere in between. And there were some stars that were very, very close to the moon. And I commented to her, I said, look at those stars. They're right next to the moon. And so we looked at them for a while, and she said, yeah, I see them. And in fact, she really didn't see anything. So my one witness was worthless, and so I noticed that one of the stars seemed to be getting bigger and bigger. I said, "Wow!" I said, "Look at that. That could be an airplane coming in." But it was stationary. It just never moved. It got bigger and bigger, and all of a sudden, it got so big that it divided into two what appeared to be stars. I said, holy smoke, look at that. There are two of them. And so they remained stationary for at least 5 or 6 minutes without moving. But one became two. And then I said, I believe they're moving to the south, because we were looking eastward. And I said, yes, look, they're both moving together. And then they began to move apart, where one went up and the other remained stationary, more or less flying along the horizon. And so this really got my juices going, because I'd never seen anything quite like this. And then the one on top accelerated rapidly and then took off straight up, just like it was shot out of a cannon. And I'd never seen any aircraft do anything like that. And I was just stunned to see it. And then the second one, the lower one, kept moving straight along the horizon toward the south, toward the Gulf of Mexico, and then it took off at the same rate of speed. And it was just a blur. I mean, it wasn't even fast. It just streaked up and was gone. So that was the sighting. Mm-hmm. And all I can say is that on the way home, we told her parents what we had seen, and they seemed very interested and believed us, because they knew I was not the kind of young man who made up silly stories. And but when I got home, I told my mother about it, and it just was. She said, "Well, make sure you write down everything so you'll remember it." And so I did. And I was in my room making notes and writing it out, and I was so frightened by what I saw. It wasn't, I mean, there was the initial exhilaration, but upon reflection, I realized that I had seen something that was absolutely mind-blowing, and I was afraid. I don't know what I was afraid of. I guess I was afraid that maybe they saw me and knew that I saw them, and that they somehow, I had a feeling that they must have known that I saw this. And so I made detailed notes on everything. And as a young scientist, later when I was in high school, I won the science fair as a sophomore. So that gives you an idea of the kind of notes that I was making even at 12 years of age. So I made very, very detailed notes. And so the next day I told my mother, I said, Mother, I'm going to write a report and send it to the Air Force. And she says, oh, no, you don't want to do that. I said, well, why not? She says, oh, no. She said, that would just create problems. You don't want to do that. Don't do that. So I went ahead and I wrote up a letter, and I consolidated my notes and put it in the best language that I could. And I addressed it to UFO Investigations, Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, and mailed it. We didn't have zip codes in 1956, and Eglin was, figured the post office knew where that was because it's not really in a city. It's just Eglin Air Force Base. And I dropped it in the mail and didn't think anything more about it. Now, less than a week later, it was a Saturday morning, the phone rings. And so my job at the house, since my parents were divorced, so I lived with my mother and my grandmother. And so my job as the man of the house was to always answer the phone, which I did. And a man on the other end said, may I speak to George Gaines? And I said, this is he. And he said, is this the same George that lives at such and such an address? I said, yes, it is. And he says, is this the same George who sent a report to the Air Force a few days ago about what you had seen? And I took a deep breath and said, yes, it is. And he says, well, great. He said, George, what are you doing this morning? I said, and so I immediately said, I'm going to the pool to swim, because I was a collegiate swimmer and high school swimmer, and so I was, we're going to go to practice. And I said, I'm going to swim practice. And he said, George, he said, you just sit tight. We'll be right over. And I remember those words so clearly. George, you just sit tight. We'll be right over. It didn't say, can we come by? How do you do? Or anything. We're coming over. So I realized then that I was in a jam, and I had to explain to my mother very quickly what had happened. I said, Mother. I said, she said, who is that? I said, it was a nice man. You remember I said I was thinking about submitting a report to the Air Force? She says, you didn't. I said, yes, I did. And I said, they're coming over. She says, oh, my God. She says, now we're in trouble. We're in trouble. I mean, this is 1956, and, things were different then. It was a different world, and so you didn't file reports or anything unless you had good reason, and I thought I had good reason. So, I told my grandmother, and she says, oh, Lordy, she says, you're in trouble now. I said, well, I told the truth. I didn't make anything up. It's all true. It's all true. And so while we were talking, I mean, this couldn't have been more than 5 minutes from when I hung up, maybe not that long. My grandmother, who used to sit in the living room looking out the window, she says, oh, here they come. And so my mother and I went to the door, and she, saw them. They pulled up in a 4-door 1955 or 56. I couldn't tell the exact model. I always thought it was a 55. White Cadillac, air conditioned. It was absolutely spotless. And I remember thinking, why isn't it gray and why doesn't it have military stencils on it, saying U.S. Air Force or U.S. Navy or something? But it was a civilian car, but it was a beautiful white Cadillac. And it was air conditioned, and that was very unusual because we didn't have air conditioning in our home in Florida. And I never knew anybody who had an air conditioned car until in 1958. So this was quite a rare event. And then out of the car come 2 Air Force officers, men who were dressed as Air Force officers, who come up and greet me and my mother on the front porch. So why don't I just take a quick pause and say, do you have any questions that you want to ask me at this point before we get into the interview?
No, not really. It's you and I had kind of gone over this in our talk. I think it was, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months ago. So it's all almost like new coming at me. But I couldn't remember the encounter of what your sighting was to begin with. But just the fact that they came to see you that quickly is pretty interesting.
Well, yes. I mean, I didn't think through it very carefully at the time. I was just really scared that they were coming to talk to me because I didn't know what to expect. But the two gentlemen came in and they showed my mother some identification in addition to their uniforms, and she welcomed them and said, "Please come in." They said, "Well, we would like to talk to George about what he saw." And so the two were it was a captain and a lieutenant. And the captain did not have what I would call a military bearing. He seemed to be sweating a little bit. It was hot, and so he unbuttoned his blouse when he sat down and crossed his legs and made himself very much at home. He just seemed very comfortable. And then the lieutenant was just the opposite. He was buttoned down. He had on I think what you call almost an Eisenhower jacket, as opposed to the captain with the blouse. It was very tight around the waist, and he had a tie on, and he had a crew cut dark hair with salt and pepper. The captain had longer hair and just seemed more. He seemed more like a civilian dressed up in an Air Force uniform, and so they began the questioning in the living room. And so the captain then asked the lieutenant to go out and once we agreed to do it, he sent the lieutenant out to the car and he opened the trunk up and brought all sorts of stuff in. He brought in charts that were on like a movie screen with flip charts. He brought in a movie screen, a movie projector, and what I remember most vividly was a reel-to-reel Wollensack tape recorder, where everything in the interview was being taped, and that thing just ran and ran and ran. So they began, and I don't remember all of what was said or what was asked, but I do remember the captain or the lieutenant standing up like he was giving a military briefing, and he had a pointer stick, and he kept pointing, to these charts of the sky and this, and he was using a lot of technical language like azimuth, perigee, apogee, and stuff that I really was not familiar with. And the captain would kind of interpret for him. He said, "Okay, what the lieutenant is saying is this. George, tell me more about how you saw this. And they, of course, had my report there, which they let me look at. And about that time, I'd say probably an hour into it, my mother had gotten on the phone and called the parents of the young girl who was with me. And it turned out to be a real embarrassment for her because she had nothing to add to it. Now, she had made up a report as well of what she didn't see. And on that report, she doodled and drew a picture of like an alien coming out of a spaceship. You know, it was a cartoon-like. And so when they came up there, the captain saw that, and he just grabbed it and took it out of range. He says, "I'll take that." And so, you know, he had that. She stayed around for about 15 minutes and listened and couldn't really add anything because she didn't see anything. And then they asked her to go ahead. You know, she could go back home. So then they got out some films and showed me films. Now some of the films I remember having seen before, and it was like, you know, it was daytime scenes of maybe 4 or 5 lights flying together, or what could be interpreted as UFOs. And they kept asking me, "Is this what you saw? You see something like that?" I said, "Well, no, mine weren't doing that. It was just 2." And you know, I really stuck to my story because Martin. That's the only story I had, and I didn't know what else to do other than stick to the story.
Now, this is kind of curious. They were showing you films.
Yes, they had films. And
were there some really good films too of some UFOs?
They were decent. They were decent. You know, of stuff. Some stuff I'd seen in books before. Or magazines that had been published. So I kept thinking, well, I've seen all this before. He said, "You ever seen this?" I said, "Well, I've seen something like that in a magazine, but some I had not seen." And so after we got through with the movies, I guess it was around lunchtime. Well, these guys didn't stop for lunch. And my mother and grandmother, particularly my grandmother, she was very nosy and kept walking into the room and walking out of the room and in and out like she thought I was going to be molested or something. So finally they told my mother, they said, "Look, we'd like to question George now in private.
Wow.
Do you have another place where we can go?" And she said, "Yeah, we have a den, a small den." We went in there and set up shop, and they closed and locked the door to keep them out. So the interrogation, you know, and my grandmother said, "Well, the poor child hasn't eaten." He said, "Well, we'll let him have something to eat when we're finished." You know. So we went into the den, and they brought in some scrapbooks, what I'd call scrapbooks. They were, I guess, big notebooks, big ones. And so he says, "Okay, I'm going to show you some pictures." And so these were, you know, pictures of UFOs, photographs, some sketches, and, you know, did it look like this? It looked like, I said, "Wow, that's pretty interesting there." I said, "No, it didn't." He said, "Look like that?" "No, it didn't look like that. I'm telling you, it was just a light in the sky, just a very bright light in the sky, and it was moving slow, and then it moved really fast." So went on, and, you know, went through several of these books. And finally, there was another book there, and I figured once we get through the last book, these guys will leave, because I was really, really getting tired of you know, telling the same story over and over again. And then they would stop me and say, "Okay, George, let's go back. Tell me from the very beginning what you saw." And so they must have had me repeat my story 4 or 5 times during this whole episode.
Do you think they were trying to see if you would trip up a little or something?
Yeah, I think they just, you know, it's like the cops. I mean, they're trying to see, you know, you tell the same story over and over again. And so finally, then the captain began to make suggestions. And he said, now, when the craft got close, could you see any portholes? I said, I don't know how close it got, but it wasn't close enough that I could see any detail. He says, okay. So when the craft got close, could you see anybody looking out of a porthole? I said, I just said, no, it didn't get that close. And then you go on, and then he'd come back and say, now, George, when the craft landed, did a door open? I said, the craft didn't land. I wish it had. I wish I could say it did, but it didn't. It just flew off, and it flew off at a very high rate of speed. So, he went through all this highly suggestive questioning. And finally, I said, he's got to show me this last book. I said, are you going to show me when are you going to show me what's in the last scrapbook? He said, well, George, you said you didn't see anybody, right? I said, right, I didn't. He said, well, I'm not so sure you didn't. And I said, I didn't. And he says, well, I'll show you what's in here anyhow. And so when we went through this book was filled with pictures and sketches of aliens.
Really?
All kinds. I mean, ridiculous looking. Some I'd seen in comic books. I said, "Oh, I've seen that. I've seen that in a comic book." He said, "Okay, next one." And then he showed me a picture. I remember it very, very distinctly because my eyes must have just lit up like a cheap pinball machine. Looked like an alien laying on an examining table. Kind of like, I guess, when I saw the Alien Autopsy, movie, I said, whoa, that looks a lot like what the captain showed me. I mean, I was probably 40 or 50 years old when I saw that for the first time. And I said, well, I've seen that before. So I asked him, I said, whoa, is that real? And he looked at me and kind of smiled. He said, does it look real to you? I said, it looks real to me. Is it? And he just wouldn't answer. And then we got to the end of the book, and he says, okay, George, we're done. Thank you so much. Thank my mother. And it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he and the lieutenant got in their Cadillac and left. Now, a lot of reconstruction has gone on since then. This was, a long time ago. The one thing that was said as they were leaving, my mother asked the captain, do you all investigate every sighting from a 12-year-old boy? You must be getting hundreds of these. He says, ma'am, we get thousands of these reports. He said, but this report was very interesting to us. We wanted to talk to George because he was very thorough in his documentation. We believe every word he said. And to be honest, we had some corroborating information from other sources to corroborate the sighting. So we wanted to hear his story. And he said, the only thing I would ask you is I would advise you, I can't order you, he said, but I would advise you strongly never to discuss this with anyone.
Now, did he
actually
say this to you, or was that to your mother?
It was to my mother, but I heard it.
Uh-huh.
And it was spoken really to both of us. And so I never discussed it until I was probably in my late 40s.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, I was silent for over 30 years before I said anything about it.
Wow. And one of the things we left out, you're probably going to bring it up, is who one of the gentlemen were. That's right.
I didn't know who these guys were, and in the late 1980s, early 1990s, of course, we had the famous Gulf Breeze sightings in the Pensacola area. And my oldest daughter was very, very interested in this, and she became an active member of the MUFON chapter there in Pensacola. And she begged me to come to a meeting and tell the story. And I said, Beth, I'm not going to do it. Just not going to do it. And so finally it was at Christmas time, and she said, would you at least come to the Christmas party? They're having a nice Christmas party. So I went to the party, and it was really, really a nice affair. A lot of people were there. And one of the guys I knew asked me about it. He said, your daughter told me something about the sighting. I said, yeah. He said, there are a couple of Air Force guys here who would really like to meet you and talk to you. So these guys were probably 20 years older than me, I guess, at the time. So they must have been probably late 60s, early 70s. And so I learned a great deal about them. And I told them the story. They said, well, number one, Eglin Air Force Base had no investigating authority. These guys did not come from Eglin. Number two, they most likely came down from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio because they were the primary investigators. And number three, they may not even have been Air Force. They may have been CIA or NSA because a lot of the investigators were wearing military uniforms during these investigations that went on in Project Blue Book in the later years. So all of that is partially true because I found out through the Internet by looking at pictures. When I saw the picture of Captain Edward Ruppelt, who was the head of Blue Book until 1953, I said, there he is. That's who came to see me. I would know him anywhere. Slightly pudgy, chubby cheeks, just a charming individual to talk to, and he must have been a special guy because for a captain, somebody with the rank of captain, to have that kind of authority, he must have been just a remarkable officer. I mean, he had a distinguished combat record in Korea and so forth, and distinguished himself in every way. But he was evidently a superb manager, and that's why he was given the Blue Book assignment. Now, he had retired in 1953. He was no longer in the Air Force. He was out. And he took a job as a consulting engineer, aeronautical engineer, with North American Aviation out in California, and was living in California at the time in 1956.
So do you think they flew him all the way to Florida to talk to you?
Yes. Yes, I do.
Amazing.
He collaborated with Blue Book after he left. And I don't know how many investigations he did, but now his book was first published in August of 1956. So he was already working on a revision. And, he may have wanted this material for his revision. How he found out about the sighting, I'm sure that, he was in regular contact with the Blue Book staff. The lieutenant turned out to be a Lieutenant Robert Olson. I don't know if Olson had retired or not. He was a little bit younger, but I found his photograph on the Internet with Ruppelt, and they were there together looking at some charts, and I said, whoa, there's the second guy. I'd know him anywhere. So I only found out their identities perhaps 6 months ago when I was doing this research. And I was thrilled to do this because, I always wondered, who were these guys? Who were these guys that came to see me? Now, maybe Ruppelt was in Wright-Patterson on an assignment when something happened, when he got the report and decided to fly down to Pensacola. But they didn't drive over. I mean, they probably flew into NAS, Pensacola, and got the rental car and from an admiral or something, and came on out to see me. But Captain Ruppelt had suffered a heart attack earlier that year, and I suspect that, to me, he just looked uncomfortable, like he was sweating, and he never went out to the car to bring anything in. He just stayed in a chair the whole time, and Olson went out and got everything and brought it in. Of course, he was the lower-ranking officer, and I guess that would explain it. But it seemed that he was a bit fatigued, and then, of course, we know tragically Captain Ruppelt died of a heart attack in 1960. His wife lived out in California. I believe she passed away the late 1990s or right around 2000. Captain Ruppelt had a brother who lived in the Sarasota area, not far from me, but he passed, I believe, in 2010. So Edward Ruppelt was one heck of a fine officer, outstanding career, raised in, I believe, in Nebraska or Iowa, somewhere in the Corn Belt area, and just was just an outstanding young man and student in college, and engineer. And when you read about him, you can't help but admire him. And I certainly enjoyed my 7 or 8 hours of working with him on this little project that I created. He was a total gentleman, and we developed really an excellent rapport during that time. Lieutenant Olson was always in the background, so I never had much of a chance to develop a relationship with him. But with Ruppelt, it was special. And like I said, the minute I saw his picture on the internet, I didn't even know who it was. I said, that's the guy. There he is. And then I did the background research on him.
Yeah. And how about his book? Is like one of the according to Alejandro Rojas, who was just on with the news, he thinks it's the best book on UFOs ever written.
I would say it certainly was. He was amazingly forthcoming in the book. I mean, he didn't. It was not an effort to debunk at all. It was a very open-minded, objective look at it, and he went into a great deal to report on some of the investigations that they had done. However, the word got out through channels that the government or the Air Force was not pleased with the book. At first, they said, yeah, it's a very good book and all that, but back channel information was delivered to Ruppelt that it was not something they were happy with, and they wanted him to put out a revision. And so a revised edition came out, I think, about a year and a half later. And in the revised edition, he took a different view. He basically, it was just one section at the end where he just kind of said, well, it's just all imagination. And then he died in 60. Now, there's been, stuff on the internet. Some people that knew him and lived there said that one woman, I think she may still be alive. She was 95 a couple of years ago. Said that she was a neighbor of theirs, and that her husband and Ed Ruppelt rode to work together every day. And what their work was, she said she didn't know because they never, ever discussed it. She said, but she always believed, and her husband believed, that Ruppelt was murdered.
Really?
And that he did not die of natural causes.
Oh. Well, you said earlier he had a heart attack.
Yes. Yeah, had the heart attack in 56, and then fatal heart attack or whatever in 60.
Yeah.
37 years old.
So he was 32 years old when he had his first heart attack, which is very young.
Very, very young.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. So
his brother passed away. I think his slightly younger brother. I think he was in his upper 80s, 87. 88.
Yeah. So it's just there's longevity in his family, but it didn't happen with him.
No, it didn't.
So have you? Now, was this case part of? Let's see. Was it Grunt Project? What am I thinking of?
It's in Blue Book.
It is in Blue Book. This case is.
Yes. Yes, it is. Now, interestingly enough, about 5 years ago, when I'd attempted to go up to Montgomery, Alabama, where they had the archives, and when I finally got somebody that could talk, they said, "Oh, well, that's all now in Washington, D.C." I said, "Oh, great." So I gave up on that, but then I somehow I found out that the archives were now online, and I found what's called I'm not sure what the Air Force nomenclature is, but it's 10073. That's the form number. I guess they call it 10073. All the reports are filed on that form number. I actually found that, and I wish that I had made a copy of it, but I didn't. I found it and read the report. It was a brief synopsis, but there were no field notes or anything else attached. And the conclusion was that I had witnessed, it didn't give my name, but it said, I think it said 12-year-old, blah, 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 Pensacola, that I had witnessed a mid-air refueling operation. I thought that was a pretty clever way of explaining it, and that would have worked fine, except when the two separated, they don't do that. So that was the explanation, but no field notes were attached. Since that time, I've gone back to Blue Book archives, and I have searched exhaustively. And all I can find is a reference to the date, a reference to just that there was a sighting and in Pensacola, Florida, that date, and it says case missing.
Missing?
Case missing.
How about that? So you actually saw it at one time, and then it's gone.
As God is my witness, I saw it. And showed it to my wife and kids. They all saw it. We all saw it, read it together. I said, well, that's kind of a downer because, at least they could have said it was unexplained. But no, I mean, that was the explanation, which I guess is plausible. And they said that it was the refueling was over Tyndall Air Force Base in Panama City, which is about 105 miles away by the Crow. It's pretty far away to see lights pretty darn close. So,
wow.
Evidently they had seen something. I don't know whether it was radar, visual, civilian, military sighting, but somebody had seen something that really, really tweaked their interest. I've talked to, some experts back in the 90s, guys that are, are part of the regular talk show group, and they basically say, well, your sighting is nothing. I mean, all you saw were night lights, and that's nothing. That wouldn't have justified them coming out. There must have been some other reason why they came out. And when you consider that it was Ed Ruppelt himself and Robert
Olson?
Yeah, Olson, two of the mainstays in the organization, that they came almost 3 years after Ruppelt was out in a civilian. You know, he still had his uniform, I guess, but wow. I mean, what prompted it?
So that's it for the free part of the show. If you'd like to become a member and subscribe, you can find that information on podcastufo.com for only $2 a month or more. You can help support the show. This is a member-supported show. Don't forget, you can always listen to the whole show for free if you listen live on Podcast UFO or PSN Radio at 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or you can listen to the full podcast for free on the Dark Matter Digital Network every Thursday at 10 to midnight Eastern Standard Time. Talk to you next week, and remember to keep your eyes to the sky.